Hi, everyone. So today we are continuing with our discussion of David Hume, David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. And I want to do a little review of what we went over on Monday on part one, and then get into part two and also prepare for part three, which we'll discuss in more detail again on Monday. So we discussed the foundation for Hume's thinking, Hume's philosophy, right? That Hume is an empiricist who believes that knowledge comes through the senses, right? That our knowledge of the external world is derived from sensory experience. So, as an empiricist, he rejects the idea of innate ideas and right embraces what we would think of as a more scientific outlook, which is that our ideas are formed through our experience of the external world. Now, as we mentioned, right, there are one of the things that Hume is trying to explain in part one of book one of the understanding, part one of ideas, their origin, composition, connection, and abstraction. One of the things he's trying to explain is how our knowledge comes from the senses, right? And this is the distinction that he makes between impressions and ideas, right? An impression is a sensory experience. An impression is, right, I see the sky, and that seeing, right, the sight of the sky is the impression, right? It makes an impression on my senses, and so an impression is vivid, lively, and forceful, right? It is immediate. There's detail, there's certainty, there's clarity in the immediate impression. For Hume, then, the impression that we get through our senses becomes an idea, right? An idea is of an impression, of a sensory experience. So now when I close my eyes and think of the sky, I have an idea of the sky. But that idea is going to be less lively, vivid, and forceful, right? It's not going to have the same detail. It's going to be much more amorphous and changeable. Right? So for Hume, ideas are less real, less forceful, and have less content than impressions. And ideas are based in impressions, right? By ideas, I mean the faint images of impressions, right, in thinking and reasoning. So, having made this distinction between impressions and ideas, the next point for Hume is to explain the difference between complex and simple ideas. Right? So, a simple idea is an idea of an impression, right? Just as my idea, right? I have an idea of the impression of the sky when I close my eyes and remember it. Simple idea is an idea that corresponds to a particular piece of sensory data, right? So I have an idea of blue, and my idea of blue is based on that impression. And that simple idea is simple because it can't be broken into parts, right? There's no further reduction I can do on the idea of blue. Idea of blue is irreducible, indivisible, and I can. Not only is it impossible to break the idea of blue down into parts, but I'm able to use the idea of blue as a part of other complex ideas. So for Hume, our complex ideas are constructed out of simple ideas. Right? We get a collection of impressions which give us a collection of simple ideas, and then we build a complex idea out of that simple idea. And so I'm looking at a plant, and I see green, and I see straight lines, and I see right the shape of leaves, and I see uh, the brown of the pot and this cylindrical shape of the pot. And so all of these simple ideas, right? The idea of a cylinder, the idea of brown, the idea of straight lines, the idea of shape of a leaf, um, the green, the um, brown, these ideas are then assembled into a complex idea, right? The idea of a potted plant. Uh, but what I actually see, right, what my senses grasp, is nothing more than those simple ideas, right? It is not through my senses that I see a potted plant. Uh, the construction of the idea of the potted plant happens in my mind. Right? I construct the complex idea potted plant out of that collection of simple ideas, which correspond directly to the sensory impressions. Now, I'm able to recognize the potted plant. I'm able to recognize any potted plant because there is a sort of general collection, right, that always corresponds to this phenomenon of potted plant. Right? So the potted plant as an actually existing phenomenon uh, always has a certain collection of simple ideas, and that particular collection of ideas constitutes the complex idea. But the point is, right, that I don't have sensory experience of potted plant. I have a sensory experience of color and shape, and a certain collection of colors and shapes that I've constructed into this complex idea of potted plant. So complex ideas are constructs, right? Rational constructs. And um, another important point here, which we didn't go over very much in class, is this idea of representation. Right? That the way that this works, the way that an impression becomes an idea, is that the mind represents the impression to itself. Uh, and so I said a little bit about the way in which Hume is very different from Descartes, but also there are moments of crossover, moments of influence um, between Descartes and Hume. And I think that this idea of representation is certainly a Cartesian idea. Right? We can remember, uh, this discussion in Descartes about the way the mind um, grasps objects in the external world, and Descartes calls it representation. Right? The mind represents things to itself, and it is accuracy of representation that grants clarity and distinctness to an idea. Right? An idea is clear and distinct when it accurately represents its external object, the external object that it is intended to represent. So when I think in my head about about a potted plant, I represent it to myself, and then when I represent it in my mind, right, when I in my mind's eye envision a potted plant, the the idea will be true. The idea will be accurate to the extent that my representation then corresponds to my actual experience. So when I represent the potted plant in my head, does it have the you know the cylinder of the pot, the lines of the branches, the shape of the leaves, the colors, all of this correct? And for Hume, uh, it's a little less clear in Descartes, at least in the Meditations. But for Hume, right, one represents a particular object. One has an idea of a particular potted plant in this case. Ideas are more real, more forceful, more accurate when they're ideas of particular things rather than when they are ideas of general things. We touched on this a little bit in class, right? This is the discussion of abstract and universal or general ideas, and how for Hume, uh, contrary to most philosophy, right, most of the philosophical tradition, for Hume, general universal ideas are less real, have less accuracy and truth to them than ideas about particular things. And the reason would be that our representations of, right, ideas are always representations, and ideas that represent individuals are going to have more accuracy in their representation. A general abstract idea, universal idea, doesn't represent anything, right? And so, for that reason, a general abstract idea is going to be um, much less real than an idea of a particular. Um, that's a really major philosophical idea, innovation. I don't think Hume is the first one to say this, but um, he says it forcefully, right? That universal ideas are uh, disconnected from reality, and our thinking is more accurate and real when we are thinking about particular things. Um, you know, most of philosophy is, or much of philosophy is preoccupied with universals, abstract thought, right? Ideals. And Hume is saying all of those ideas are amorphous, unreal, unreliable, imaginary, right? In essence, constructed, uh, we would say today constructs. Um, our universals are constructs. They do not relate to the outside world. They don't represent anything in the external world. Right? They are abstractions of our mind. They have no bearing on reality. Um, so this is a major assertion, right? All universal thinking is imaginary. um, but in any case, right, this idea of representation and this whole argument about how representation can be accurate is based on this distinction between simple and complex ideas. Like a simple idea, like the idea of blue, has an exact correspondence to an impression. It exactly represents an impression. Representation, correspondence. Right? Ideas correspond and represent. Simple ideas, uh, complex ideas represent collections of simple ideas or simple impressions in the external world. Now, having established this idea, right, that simple ideas represent impressions, complex ideas are uh, rational constructs of simple ideas. What Hume, as we mentioned already, is most interested in is the connection between ideas. How do we connect one idea with another? So, how do I know that, again, this is not a brilliant example, but that the uh, collection of impressions that I get when observing this potted plant, how do I know that they are related? Or how do I know what their relation is? Right? I know uh, that when I look at the base of the potted plant, I see the brown pot. Uh, and that then when I move my eyes up, I see the green of the leaves. I know that every time I move my eyes from the bottom to the top, there is this contiguity, right? That the brown of the pot precedes the green of the plant when I move my eyes from bottom to top. Now, those are two distinct impressions, right? Or two distinct impressions. The brown of the round pot, the green of the leaves and stalks. What's their connection? How do I understand their connection? How do I know uh, what their relation is? Right? Uh, so this question of relation is so important for Hume because, as we just said, the only thing that we have a direct representation of is simple idea. So all complex ideas involve relation, right? Involve relations between ideas. Now, Hume's real insight is that relations in general are non-empirical, that we don't see or have any sensory information about relations between simple ideas, relations between impressions. Relations are not something that we get through our senses, right? I have sensation, an impression of the brown pot. I have an impression of the green leaves. I don't have any impression of how those two are connected. I see them together, but I don't know what their relation is. Okay, so we'll say a lot more about this, but right, that relations are non-empirical. Relations are rational, and they are something that we add after we experience. And Hume says there are three essential kinds of relation, connection, or association between ideas. These three are resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. So, resemblance, contiguity, cause and effect, right? Let me just say a little bit about the first two. We're going to talk, let me do what Hume does here and say a little bit about the first two, and then we're going to put off cause and effect for a minute. So resemblance means that one idea resembles another, right? So that the blue of the sky resembles the blue of my shirt. They aren't identical, but they're similar. Contiguity implies, right, sequence in time or place, right? So I know that the green of the leaves, the brown of the pot are contiguous, right? I move my eyes from top to bottom. I will always have an impression of brown and the idea of brown, and then the impression of green and the idea of green. So the idea of green and the idea of brown are contiguous, right? I know that the one will always follow the other when I move my eyes in a certain direction. Ideas are contiguous also, right, in terms of time. I know that, for example, sleeping has to come before waking, right? That If I am asleep, I will wake up. Right? That uh, the sequence of events, of ideas, has a certain temporal nature. Right? There's a time series involved there. So there's a relation between sleeping and waking, which is contiguous in time, just as the relation between green and brown is contiguous in space when I'm looking at the potted plant. So we relate ideas to each other in space and time. It's different than resemblance, right? Ideas don't have to resemble each other in order to be contiguous. So let me back up just one page here and think about how these relations are added. How do we add the idea of contiguity? That is, what makes a thing contiguous? Why is the brown of the pot contiguous with the green of the leaves? Why is waking contiguous with sleeping in terms of time? Or why does the blue of the sky resemble the blue of my shirt? Where are these relations established? And Hume says there are two kinds of, let's see, what does he say? Impressions, he writes in section 2 of part 1. Impressions may be divided into two kinds, those of sensation and those of reflection. The first kind arises in the soul originally from unknown causes. Right? So senses are senses. Right? Sensation, impressions of sensation arise through our senses. Hume says from unknown causes. In other words, we don't know what causes the impression in our senses. Right? We don't know what the external world is. We only know that we have an impression of it. This is the impression we have of it. We don't know what causes that impression. Right? We don't know what makes the leaves green or the pot brown. We know that it is brown, that it is green. We have an impression. We don't know why the impression is what it is. The second, reflection, he says, is derived in a great measure from our ideas, and that in the following order. An impression first strikes us upon the senses and makes us perceive heat or cold, thirst or hunger, pleasure or pain, or some other kind of thing. Of this impression, there is a copy taken by the mind, which remains after the impression ceases. And this we call an idea. The idea of pleasure or pain, when it returns upon the soul, produces new impressions of desire and aversion, hope and fear, which may properly be called impressions of reflection. These again are copied by the imagination, and imagination become ideas, which perhaps in their turn give rise to other impressions and ideas. Right? So we have this important distinction between sensation and reflection. Right? And reflection is our response to a sensation. So I experience pain, and in my reflection on that experience of pain, I develop a relation to that pain, right? A relation of aversion. I am averse to pain. I want to avoid pain. Pain is bad. Now, the pain itself is nothing more than the impression of pain. What I think about pain in terms of I'm going to avoid pain, that, how does he put it, right? the ideas of desire and aversion, hope and fear, are based in this experience of pain. So we get an idea, we have an idea of desire, of aversion, an idea of hope, an idea of fear based on our emotions about uh, pain, right? I have pain. Now I have an experience, a sensory experience, or rather, an experience of reflection that is the desire to avoid pain. I experience that desire as an impression, an urge, an instinct. I recognize my instinct to avoid pain. That is an impression. The mind experiences our desires and instincts as impressions. Uh, and these impressions of desire or fear also then become ideas. Right? I remember what it's like to fear, and therefore I have an idea of fear. Um, it's this is, I think, really an interesting thought, right? Because it's also continuing the Cartesian idea of the mind-body distinction, right? That we experience our bodily reactions in a similar way uh, to the way that we experience the external world. That is to say, I have an impression of the sky, and that impression turns into an idea of the sky. But I also have an impression of an internal experience. I have an impression of aversion. I have an impression of hope, right? Uh, and the mind re- receives that impression from the body, from the soul, from the self somehow, and also turns those impressions into ideas. So that the mind is this thing that is removed from both our inner experience, our emotions, and from the external world. And the mind treats both the same way, receives impressions and turns those impressions into ideas. Now, the reason, this is an important distinction to get clear, this distinction between sensation and reflection, because it's interesting in terms of the mind-body distinction. It's interesting in terms of what Hume thinks the mind is. Right? The mind sits outside of both inner emotional experience and external experience. But it's also important because this reflection is the mind's ability to make connections, right? In developing an idea of fear, I have to connect that impression to the thing that made me fearful. To have an idea of desire, I have to connect my emotional experience of desire to the impression, external thing that I desire. So reflection is the beginning of an explanation for how we draw relations between things. It's through reflecting. For example, comparing this potted plant with a potted plant in another room, and a potted plant from when I was young, a potted plant in my friend's house. It is in reflection on those different ideas that I make relations. It's on reflection that not only I draw relationships between this potted plant and others, but also that I draw relationships between simple ideas. So my eyes move from the brown of the pot to the green of the plant. I have two impressions. And it's only when I reflect on both of those impressions, that I'm able to make some connection between them. And I'm able to relate the two ideas. So reflection is the place where these connections are made. It is not that the external world forces me to make connections. The connections are necessary. This is the key. It's not that connections are necessary in the same way that I have no choice but to perceive the plant as green. Right? Right? The green of the plant is necessary. I cannot perceive it another way, and the idea of greenness corresponds, accurately represents the impression, and that therefore the idea necessarily corresponds to the impression. However, the relation between green and brown is not necessary. Right? It is not impressed on me, imposed on me. I come up with it freely, right, of my own accord. And so, in reflection, we make these connections. The connections that explain and make possible the idea of a potted plant are not necessary. So what that is going to imply is that ultimately there is no such thing as a potted plant in terms of necessary ideas, necessary impressions. And I can show that the relation between these two impressions, the relation that I call being a potted plant, is not necessary, because I can pull the plant out of the pot. Right? I can upend that relationship. I can break that relationship. I can show that it's not necessary, that those two impressions can be separated. Their contiguity is not necessary. So relations are constructs developed in the mind through reflection. Right? And we develop these relations of our own accord, not according to necessity. Now, these kinds of relations are really interesting. Right? What Hume calls a relation. The main three kinds of relation, resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect, can be refined. And so in section 5 of part 1, he goes into more detail about these relations. Right? And so the first will be resemblance. Right? And so resemblance, we've already discussed, is about comparing different ideas, and it'll be a comparison based on degree and liveliness or vividness. So I can see that the color of the sky is more vivid or deeper, or has a different tonality than the blue of my shirt. I can compare these two based on the degree of blueness. Um, but the other more specific relations are more interesting, I think, than resemblance. And the one that is most, well, one of the most important is the relation of identity, right? So let's say a little bit about this. So we probably in common sense are disinclined to say that identity is a relation, right? Uh, we think of identity in terms of what a thing is, its being. And being, we don't think of generally as relation, um, right? I am a human being. Okay. Right? Where's the relation there? A human being is a human being. There's no relation there. Uh, a book is a book. A rock is a rock. Uh, the thing is what it is. Where's the relation in identity? Well, this is uh, one of the, I think, central insights of Hume, that we experience things in time and space. And that in order for a thing to be what it is, what it means for a thing to be what it is, what it means for a thing to have identity, is for it to be self-same, to be identical in multiple instances, in multiple times, or at multiple times, and in multiple places. That a thing is the same, that it identically resembles itself, that it is identical to itself. Uh, this morning and yesterday morning, in your apartment and outside of it. And so that what we say when we say that a thing is what it is we say that that thing is now identical to what it was then. Right? The rock is identical now to the rock as it was yesterday. So that identity, the ability to say a thing is what it is based on a self-relation, right? A thing's relation to itself, and that self-relation is one of identity, of identicalness, right? Identical through time and space. So that identity is relation to oneself. This relation I here consider is applied in its strictest sense, to constant and unchangeable objects. Without examining the nature and foundation of personal identity, which shall find its place afterwards, right? So, not thinking about the individual, the identity of a person, which obviously changes, but the identity in terms of being. A thing is what it is, but it is what it is only through time and in relation to itself at different times. So the next relation, Hume says, is time and space. After identity, the most universal and comprehensive relations are those of time and space, which are the sources of an infinite number of comparisons, such as distance, contiguity, above, below, before, after, etc. Again, time and space this is also a pretty astounding insight, actually. And we'll see this develop more. That time and space are not things that we observe. Time and space are non-empirical. We have no experience of time itself. We have no experience of space itself. Space and time are not objects of experience. So what are space and time? We're going to spend a lot of time thinking about space and time, finishing up with Hume, and then even more when we get into Kant. But for now, what Hume is saying is that space and time are primarily relations between impressions, relations between objects. That I experience space as a relation between impressions. Right? I recognize space as the distance between the plant over there and the bookshelf over here. I experience space as the distance between my chair and the bodega down the corner. I experience space as the distance between the earth and the sun, the earth and the stars. Space is nothing more than a relation of distance. Space is proximity. I experience space ultimately in relation to myself. We would go further and say things are not big or small. Things have mass. Mass is measurable. I can say that an object has a certain mass and weight at a certain time. But that's not space, right? Weight is different than space. Well, we would get into really complicated stuff there, but I think that's correct. Weight is not space. Size is about space, right? How much space does it take up? How much does it weigh? And size is a relation. Things are big or small only in relation to other things. So that nothing is in itself big or small. Things are only big or small in relation to other things or in relation to us. Right? Now, the consequences of this are actually really wild. Which is to say, that there is space somehow. It's by virtue of space that we're able to make a relation of size. Say something's bigger than something else. But what space is becomes very confusing. Because the question is then, what is the scale of the universe? What is the scale of being? Is there a being in relation to which things have a size? Right? If size is always relation, then nothing is big or small. Which would mean that the earth is big in comparison to a grain of sand, but the earth, in comparison to the galaxy, is infinitesimal. And, what that means is we just have no idea and maybe can't have any idea about something like the size of the universe. That attempting to have an objective understanding of being is always going to be based in a human scale, in relation to us, right? Okay, I'm getting lost on that train of thought. Let's keep moving. So the same is true of time, right? That there is past and future, and all things happen in a time sequence. But you never see time itself. You never have an experience of time itself. All things happen in time and are related to one another in time. But time itself is not an object of experience. I say that the pen is held, dropped, and falls. We have a time sequence there, right? Held, dropped, falls. But the sequence, the idea of a time series, right? Where you have moment one, moment two, moment three, or as they say, T1, T2, T3. That relation of sequence isn't guaranteed by experience. It's a relation that is added to the experience by my mind, right? By reflection, by relation. I say I held the pen before I dropped it, and I dropped it before it fell. But those three things are contiguous in time is a function not of any one of those moments, but of my experience of those moments, right? That I experience them contiguously. So, I think we can make a connection to Spinoza here and say, if we imagine Spinoza's worldview, right, in which every moment is predetermined, that is to say, already exists, and I am just, right, it's being revealed to me. Each new moment is not being created, but is predetermined, already laid out, and already exists. and it's just being revealed to me, we'd say it's not true in Spinoza's view that the moment of the pen falling is posterior to, happens after my dropping the pen. The dropping the pen is prior to the pen falling, only in my experience. Only because I experience it that way. Spinoza's worldview, the pen was always going to drop. It had already dropped 100,000 years ago. Right? It had been determined to drop. Its dropping was already predetermined. And it already existed. It existed as God's essence. And God's essence exists necessarily. So I think Hume is building off this idea of Spinoza's that it's possible to imagine that there actually isn't a time series, that everything already exists. And that therefore, the only reason we experience it, the only reason it appears to be linear, to be moving chronologically through time, is because of our own temporal experience, and not because of a temporality that exists external to us or in external things. So it's conceivable that we could, as it were, read existence backwards. That because everything that exists by virtue of God's essence. Nothing exists contingent on any particular moment. That therefore, if we could know God's essence, if we could know being itself, we wouldn't experience being chronologically as linear time. But we would experience it all at once as that infinite moment. And in that infinite moment, there would be neither past nor future nor present, prior or posterior. Right? And so that Hume is building off of this and saying, logically, we can't know. Logically, it's possible that time is not linear. And so that the relations of a time series, past, present, future, are, again, right, constructs. They are relations between ideas that are imposed not by the external world, but by our minds. And finally, not finally, excuse me, the other relations, the quantity and number. Quantity and number are also relations. This is also fascinating. What this means is that a unit, a one, is not something that exists in itself, but exists as a relation between impressions and is imposed again by our mind. That unity is like identity, right? A relation. But here Hume is saying it's numerical. quantity and number. What does this mean? It means, in some sense, mathematics, right, is a function of relation, a product of our minds that allows us, or helps us, to build relations between impressions. It's not to say that mathematics is false or um, can't be used to explain reality, but that whatever it is, it doesn't come from experience and is again non-empirical. And here I think, I think we can see the beginning of in all of this, right? Identity, in time and space, and now in number, a beginning of a real critique of Spinoza in Hume. Spinoza wants to say there is such a thing as a unified being, and that would be substance, that would be God. Hume is saying why do we believe that unity, that a unit, that oneness is something that actually exists? We never have an impression of oneness. Oneness, again, is a relation imposed by our minds, right? Constructed in our minds. And so to assume that there must be a oneness in being is to assume that an idea, a relation that we have from our minds, a relation between particular impressions, must also be the foundation of the external world. Hume is saying it doesn't make any sense. We can't assume that unity is a real thing. It's just an impression. So he develops this more in the next couple of sections where he's talking about, well, actually in part 2, he's talking about the infinite divisibility of our ideas of space and time. So let's read a little bit of this. The capacity of the mind is limited and never can attain a full and adequate conception of infinity. It is therefore certain that the imagination reaches a minimum. It may raise up to itself an idea of which it cannot conceive any subdivision, and which cannot be diminished without a total annihilation. When you tell me of the 1,000 and 10,000th part of a grain of sand, I have a distinct idea of these numbers and of their different proportions, but the images which I form in my mind to represent the things themselves are nothing different from each other, nor inferior to that image. Okay, sorry, that wasn't the best illustration, but what he's saying is that the idea of unity is a kind of failure of our imagination. I imagine a grain of sand is a unit, is a one. And then I would say there are, an infinite number of grains of sand on this beach. There is an exact number, presumably. But what is it that makes that grain of sand a unit, a one, which I will then use as the unit to count, the number of grains of sand on the beach, and the quantity of the beach. Hume's saying the grain of sand can be divided. It's divisible. It can be divided, in fact, into an infinite number of parts, right? Because a line, pure abstract mathematical space, is infinitely divisible. Now, you can tell me that the grain of sand is divisible. But my mind isn't capable of processing that or of thinking on those terms, right? Um, and so I end up with this unit, a grain of sand, uh, not because of the reality of the sand, that the grain of sand is actually a one and therefore indivisible, but rather because I am incapable or it's impractical for me to divide the grain of sand anymore. And again, this is about scale and size. For the dust mite, right, the grain of sand is divisible. Right? It would make sense to divide the grain of sand because the grain of sand in relation to the dust mite is much, much larger. Right? To us, it's tiny, and therefore dividing it more is impractical. So it functions as a unit. This is how all units work. This is how oneness works, what unity is. Everything can be infinitely divided. Therefore, to determine that anything is a one is a function, again, of our particular kind of perception, our particular kind of experience, and not necessarily true. Right? It is not a necessary truth that a grain of sand is a unit, a one, is united. Right? That unity is a relation that we impose based on our own experience. And so, just as number is arbitrary, what counts as a one is arbitrary. So is quantity arbitrary. And how many units are there on this beach? Well, it depends what counts as a unity. So how how dense, what volume is there on this beach? Well, that question depends on what units we're counting. Right? So that is, again, relative. So, right, number and quantity are relations. They don't exist in the external world as it's perceived. This is a major challenge to Descartes, certainly, who would say our measurement, the world exists to the extent that it can be measured. Reality is that which is determined through measurement, through the subject of pure mathematics. Hume is saying, sure, but that is always still going to be relative to yourself. And I think we can think about Spinoza again, saying, all right, so inches or in feet, which one of those is correct? How big is the earth? All forms of measurement are going to be relative. Okay, so other relations we have to do with quality and degrees of quality. When any two objects possess the same quality in common, the degrees in which they possess it form a fifth species of relation. Thus, of two objects which are both heavy, the one may be greater, either of greater or less weight than the other. Two colors that are of the same kind may yet be of different shades, and in that respect admit of comparison. And so again, quality also only exists through relation. We say, there's a famous aphorism of pre-Socratic ancient Greek philosopher. If it weren't for golden honey, figs are the sweetest thing. Fig, imagine, right? Then everything that's less sweet than a fig would be considered more sweet. So that quality, whether we call a thing sweet or not, is measured against some criterion, some standard. And what that standard is going to set the meaning of that quality. In other words, the quality is relation. So nothing is sweet in itself, right? Sweet in relation to something else, sweet in relation to us. Sixth relation. That's me getting a street cleaning ticket. Damn. Excuse me. The relation of contrariety may at first sight be regarded as an exception to the rule, that no relation of any kind can subsist without some degree of resemblance. Right? So it may seem that contrariety is necessary, right? Not a relation. But let us consider that no two ideas are in themselves contrary except those of existence and non-existence, which are plainly resembling, as implying both of them an idea of the object. So the only contrariety, the only contradiction is existence or non-existence. There are no contrary objects. In other words, black is not the opposite of white, right? Because there are many things that are the same in many respects in which they are not contrary. They're both colors. Right? They both are perceptions. They are, as much united as they are contrary. Black is only black because of the existence of white. Well, maybe that's not quite true, but right, we define them and understand them in relation to one another. So they aren't contrary in the sense of excluding one another. And rather, the idea of black absolutely contains the idea of white as being, as resembling it the least. And so they do resemble one another, but they resemble each other very little. And that's what we call contrariety. All right, so the final one then. All other objects, such as fire and water, heat and cold, are only found to be contrary from experience and from the contrariety of their causes and effects, which relation of cause and effect is a seventh philosophical relation, as well as a natural one. The resemblance implied in this relation shall be explained afterwards, right? So the next thing to consider is cause and effect. We're going to get there in a minute. Now, we already talked about this abstract ideas thing, and that's good. And I think we've covered the infinite divisibility of space and time also, which is good. So let's jump ahead to part 3 of knowledge and probability, right? So here we're going to begin the heart of Hume's argument, the most revolutionary part of this argument that we've been developing up until now. So part 3 begins by reiterating those relations that we just mentioned. There are 7 different kinds of philosophical relation: resemblance, identity, relations of time and space, proportion in quantity or number, degrees and inequality, contrariety and causation. Now, the central idea here is going to be the relation of causation, of cause and effect. So, we've seen that identity is relation. And that quantity and quality are relation. These things that appear to us to be necessary, right? Uh, Thanks, Ted. The things that appear to be necessary. Relation appears to be necessary, right? Um, Sorry, I just got distracted. One of my old high school teachers was just watching my lecture. It's very amusing. Um, excuse me. If anything is necessary, it would be cause and effect, right? Cause and effect, which is the relation between billiard balls. Most obvious example. We see cue ball hit the 8 ball, the 8 ball hits the 7 ball, and there's a chain reaction, right? Chain of events. And what Hume is saying is that just as identity, quantity, quality, number are not, in fact, experiences, objects of experience, not, in fact, impressions, it's also true that causation is not an empirical experience. That causation is also a relation that is imposed by my mind. Right? What I see, Hume says, is not causation, but rather constant conjunction. I see every time I play pool, I know that the cue ball hits the 8 ball. The cue ball stops moving and the 8 ball starts moving. I call that causation. I say the cue ball hit the 8 ball and caused it to move. But what I actually see is not causation, but constant conjunction. I know that every time the cue ball hits the 8 ball, the cue ball stops moving and the 8 ball starts moving. I see those two moments, those two impressions, the cessation of movement and the initiation of movement. But I don't know what the relation is. I'd call it causation, but it would be more accurate to say that there is constant conjunction. I think, again, we can think of this in terms of Spinoza, right? That Spinoza's idea is the 8 ball was already predetermined to move. The cue ball is not the cause of the 8 ball moving. What causes the cue ball to move and what causes the 8 ball to move are the same thing, God. So Hume is saying, I can't say that there's a necessary relation between cause and effect, of cause and effect there. All I can say is that there is constant conjunction, right? That correlation is not causation. Right? This is a Humean idea. This is an idea that you may hear, right? Correlation is not causation. That two things go together doesn't mean that one causes the other. So two things can be correlated but not have a relationship of causation. And Hume is saying all we ever see is correlation. We never see causation itself. Okay, but this is just the setup for Hume's ultimate argument about causation, which is that not only is the concept of causation non-empirical, but the concept of causation is also inherently contradictory. That our idea of causation not only isn't necessary, but implies contradiction. So he says, the idea then, this is in part 2. The idea then of causation must be derived from some relation among objects, and that relation we must now endeavor to discover. I find in the first place that whatever objects are considered as causes or effects are contiguous, right? And that nothing can operate in a time or place which is ever so little removed from those of its existence. Though distant objects may sometimes seem productive of each other, they are not. They are commonly found upon examination to be linked by a chain of causes, which are contiguous among themselves. Okay, right. So cause and effect is contiguous. The cue ball hits the 8 ball, and immediately the cue ball stops moving. The 8 ball begins moving. Right. There's contiguity there. We might say that there is a relation between distant things, as we say that the butterfly flapping its wings in the United States can cause a hurricane in China, right? But even then, there will be a chain of causes that would make those events contiguous, right? They would draw a direct line of connection. So contiguity. We may therefore consider the relation of contiguity as essential to that of causation. It says, going on a little later, the second relation I shall observe as essential to causes and effects is not so universally acknowledged, but is liable to some controversy. It is that of priority of time in the cause before the effect. Some pretend that it is not absolutely necessary that a cause should precede its effect, but that any object or action in the very first moment of its existence may exert its productive quality and give rise to another object or action, perfectly contemporary with itself. Okay, so a lot was just said very quickly here. So the second thing that we need to consider in terms of cause and effect is that cause must be prior to effect. Whenever we think of cause and effect, we have to say that a cause is prior to an effect. Right? The cue ball is set in motion prior to moving the 8 ball. We would say it's impossible that something that happens after could be the cause of something that happens before. So it's necessary that a cause is prior to an effect. If we say what made the cue ball move was the 8 ball moving, even though the 8 ball moved after, that would be nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense. So the cause has to be prior. But this is controversial, as Hume says, right? And the point is, it is incoherent and nonsensical to say that the cause could not be prior, could be after, or simultaneous, right? The cause of the 8 ball moving is not the 8 ball moving. It's the being hit by the cue ball. So it is not simultaneous, nor is it posterior. So Hume says, some pretend that it is not absolutely necessary a cause should precede its effect. right? But assert that they can be perfectly cotemporary. Now, what is cotemporary cause and effect? This is what Spinoza is getting at. This is Spinoza's idea of a self-caused being, or Descartes' idea of a self-caused being. Right? That which is self-caused will simultaneously be cause and effect. Hume's point is this is incoherent. This is nonsensical. A cause cannot be contemporaneous, cannot be cotemporal with its effect. Cause must be prior to its effect. And what this means is that God cannot be self-caused. The idea of a self-caused thing is impossible, is nonsensical. There can be no such thing as a self-caused being. So he goes on. Now, if any cause may be perfectly cotemporary with its effect, God, a self-caused being, it is certain, according to this maxim, that they must all of them be so, since any one of them, which retards its operation for a single moment, exerts not itself at that very individual time in which it might have operated, and therefore is no proper cause. The consequence of this, which we observe in the world, and indeed the utter annihilation of time. For if one cause were cotemporary with its effect, and this effect with its effect, and so on, it is plain that there would be no such thing as succession, and all objects must be coexistent. In other words, if it is possible for a cause to be cotemporary with its effect, it's possible for God to be self-caused, then that would mean there cannot be cause and effect, that there is no causation. That nothing is caused. And if nothing is caused, then there is no time. All right, so we're going to unpack this more next class when we meet again. I think I'm going to leave it there. But suffice it to say for now, what Hume has so far attempted to show is there is no substance, right? Because identity and unity are relations between impressions that are imposed by our mind and not necessary, don't come from experience. And either there is no self-caused being or there is no causation. And the implication of the latter would be that there is no time. So Hume has presented a couple of major reasons to doubt this philosophy. And we will go into this question of causation and time in much greater detail on Monday.